In the heart of a relentless storm, a group of disciples faces not just the fury of the sea, but the deepest fears of their own hearts, only to discover that the light they've been searching for was never out of reach. Will they find their way home, or will the storm swallow them whole? Listen closely, for this is the story of how faith turns even the fiercest darkness into the brightest dawn. The Sea of Galilee was as unpredictable as the storms that raged in the hearts of men. One moment it was calm, the waters shimmering like glass beneath the brilliant sun. The next, it was a fury of crashing waves and swirling wind, dark clouds churning overhead, and the air thick with a tension that seemed to speak of something greater, a force beyond nature itself. On this evening, as the disciples sat in the small fishing boat, the wind had begun to rise, and the first hints of the storm were felt in the salt air. Peter, his knuckles white from gripping the side of the boat, watched the horizon, feeling an unease grow in the pit of his stomach. The familiar lake, a place of so many memories, now seemed like an unrecognizable, dangerous expanse. His heart raced, not from the boat's creaking or the waves that slapped the sides with force, but from an inner fear he could not quell. The storm, in its unpredictable violence, seemed to mirror the turmoil within him, the same tumultuous emotions that plagued his thoughts, often unnoticed. "Rabbi," Peter called over the rising wind, his voice strained. "The storm is getting worse. We need to turn back." Jesus, at the bow of the boat, remained standing, his robes billowing around him like a soft, undisturbed cloak of peace amidst the storm. His face, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning, was calm, serene, unaffected by the tempest that threatened to consume them. The others huddled close together in fearful silence, clutching their seats, praying silently, but Peter's voice could no longer be contained. He knew that if they didn't act soon, the boat would capsize and the waves would swallow them whole. Yet Jesus stood unmoving, as though he was made of something more substantial than flesh and bone, something indestructible, impervious to the world's fury. "Rabbi, should we not seek shelter? Should we not find a safe place?" Peter's voice was thick with panic now, his normally steadfast resolve slipping beneath the weight of the storm. Jesus turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Peter's with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the chaos. "We cannot turn back, Peter," Jesus said softly, his voice steady amidst the howling winds. "The storm will pass. We must move forward, not away." Peter felt a wave of frustration rise in his chest. How could Jesus remain so calm when they were on the verge of disaster? He looked to the others, seeing the same fear reflected in their eyes. James, his face pale with terror, was muttering prayers under his breath, his hands clutched together in a desperate, silent plea to be saved. John, normally so composed, was staring out at the dark horizon, his face etched with doubt. "Rabbi," Peter pleaded again, "the storm, it is unlike any we have ever faced. How can we trust that it will pass?" Jesus gave a soft, almost imperceptible smile, though his eyes remained intense, as if he could see through the storm and into the hearts of his disciples. "The storm does not define the journey," he said, his voice like a balm for the nerves that frayed at the edges of their hearts. "It is what you choose to believe in the storm that matters most. You will not perish today, Peter. Trust that the journey has purpose. The sea is wild, yes, but your hearts are wilder still, torn by doubt and fear. These storms are not what threaten you. It is the storm within that you must face." The storm raged on, unrelenting in its fury as the boat pitched and rocked in the violent waves. For hours, it seemed, they fought against the elements, the wind battering their faces, the salt water stinging their eyes. The thunder clapped above them, and the waves surged in chaotic swells, making it almost impossible to stay upright in the small vessel. The disciples worked together, pulling at the ropes and trying to steady the sails, but the storm seemed to have a mind of its own, throwing their efforts aside with cruel disregard. The fear in their hearts began to intensify as they watched the waves grow higher, felt the boat lurch dangerously from side to side. In the midst of all this, Jesus remained utterly still. He was not working alongside them, trying to control the boat or steady the sail. He was standing at the bow, his eyes gazing into the heart of the storm with a profound stillness that seemed to transcend the violent world around them. It was as though he was not in the storm at all, but standing on solid ground, removed from the chaos. "Rabbi," James cried out, his voice breaking with emotion. "We are going to die out here. Why are you not helping us?" Jesus turned his gaze slowly from the storm to James, his eyes filled with an almost infinite sadness, but also a great compassion. "James," he said softly, his voice cutting through the wind, "do you not yet see? The storm is not what threatens you. It is your fear, your doubt, that holds you captive. If you believe that the storm will consume you, then you are already lost. But if you choose to see beyond it, to believe in something greater, then you will find your way." James could not understand. His fear was so real, so tangible, that it overshadowed everything else. The boat was going to sink. The sea was going to swallow them whole, and all their faith in Jesus could not change that. But something about the way he said it, the calmness in his voice, the peace he seemed to radiate despite the storm, made James pause. "Rabbi," Peter spoke again, his voice cracking, "tell us what we must do. Tell us how we can get through this." Jesus' eyes were piercing now, his gaze unwavering as he looked at each of them. "Trust in the light that you cannot yet see," he said, his words like a quiet whisper carried on the wind. "The light is always there. You must believe in it even when the darkness is all around you." Hours passed as the storm grew wilder. The boat had taken on water, and the disciples were exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from the ceaseless pounding of the waves. The shore was nowhere in sight. The lighthouse, which had appeared as a beacon on the horizon, was now barely visible, its light dimmed by the thickening fog and the mist that clung to the air. It seemed so far away, so unreachable. Peter's heart ached with the feeling of helplessness that clung to him like a weight he could not shake. He could feel his hopes slipping away like the receding tide, and it frightened him more than the storm itself. "Do you see it, John?" Nathanael asked, his voice hoarse from the strain of shouting over the storm. There's a light." John squinted through the rain, his eyes narrowing against the wind, and then nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with a strange awe. "It's a lighthouse. We must be close to land." But as they tried to steer the boat toward the light, the waves only seemed to grow stronger. With each effort they made to row towards the distant beacon, they were pushed back further into the darkness. It was as if the sea itself was holding them captive, mocking their every attempt to reach the shore. Peter's heart sank. How could they possibly reach that light, when the waves themselves seemed determined to keep them from it? But then, through the chaos and the panic, Jesus spoke again, his voice a steady, calming force in the midst of the storm. "The light does not move," he said simply, his words clear and confident. "It remains constant no matter how far you sail from it. You do not need to chase the light, it is always with you. You must only trust in it." Peter's mind reeled. How could he trust in something he could barely see? How could he believe in the light when the storm was so all-consuming, when the waves were so high and the night so dark? But Jesus' voice, calm and certain, began to work its way into his heart, giving him the first glimmer of hope he had felt all night. Perhaps, he thought, he was not meant to fight against the storm. Perhaps the storm was not the enemy at all. "How do we find the light, then?" John asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Jesus looked at him with a deep understanding, his eyes reflecting something beyond the storm, a love, a certainty that could not be shaken by the winds. "The light is not something you chase, John. It is something you carry within you. It is the faith that you choose to hold on to, even in the darkest of moments." The storm raged on, but Jesus' words seemed to echo in the hearts of the disciples. They could not deny it any longer, their fear was greater than the storm. The storm outside was a reflection of the storm within them. Each man grappled with his own insecurities, his own doubts, and it was those fears that threatened to drown them long before the sea could. Thomas, ever the skeptic, was the first to voice what everyone else had been thinking. "What if the light is a mirage?" he said, his voice laced with doubt. "What if we are chasing something that isn't even real? The lighthouse, it could be a trick. What if we're heading straight into more danger, into something worse?" Peter could feel the weight of Thomas's words settling like a stone in his chest. What if Thomas was right? What if the light was a lie, a cruel illusion meant to torment them? But Jesus' eyes never wavered. "The light is real," he said simply. "It does not deceive. It is always there, waiting for you to see it." The storm persisted, though now it was more than just the tumult of the sea. The air seemed charged with an energy that unsettled the disciples on a level deeper than the physical. Each wave that crashed against the boat felt like a battering of their souls, each gust of wind an accusation. The night felt like it was closing in on them, the darkness heavier than it had been when they first set sail. As they clung to the boat, fighting against the relentless pull of the water, fear began to take root in their hearts. Fear not of the storm, but of themselves. Peter stood frozen, gripping the side of the boat, his mind spinning. The words Jesus had spoken were starting to make sense, but it wasn't enough. The storm was still too loud. The fear was too loud. His thoughts seemed to echo within him, a cacophony of self-doubt. "What if I can't do this?" he thought. What if I'm not strong enough? What if this is all beyond me? He felt himself trembling, his hands slick with sweat, his breath shallow and erratic. He had faced danger before, had fought for survival in the wilderness of his youth, but this storm felt different. This wasn't just an external force he could battle, it was an internal war, a war of his heart. The storm had stripped away all the layers of bravado and strength he had built around himself. Now all that was left was a raw, vulnerable heart. He was terrified. Terrified of failing Jesus. Terrified of not being enough. John too wrestled with his fear, but it manifested differently. His fear was quieter, more insidious, creeping into his soul like a slow burn. What if this was all a test? What if the storm wasn't just a storm, but a lesson he was failing? John's mind raced back to all the moments in the past when he had questioned himself. His calling, his purpose, his worthiness to follow Jesus. Those doubts that had once been whispers were now roaring, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep them at bay. "Rabbi," Thomas muttered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind, "are we meant to perish out here? Is this the end?" Jesus, who had been standing at the bow with his eyes closed, as though communing with something far beyond the raging storm, opened his eyes and turned toward the disciples. His expression was not one of frustration, nor of anger, but of compassion. His eyes, those deep, knowing eyes, swept over them all, and in that gaze Peter felt something shift. "You fear the storm because you do not understand its purpose," Jesus said, his voice calm, yet it seemed to echo through the very marrow of their bones. "Fear not the storm, for it cannot harm you. It is only a reflection of your own fears. You face it not because it is stronger than you, but because you allow it to be." Peter blinked, the truth of those words striking him like a dagger to the chest. You allow it to be. The storm was not a force that controlled him, it was his fear that gave it power. How had he allowed this tempest to consume him so completely? How had he allowed it to distort his understanding of the journey? Jesus continued, his voice unwavering. "The storm will pass, but your hearts must remain steadfast. Trust that even in the darkest moments, there is light to guide you. You must find it within yourself to believe that you will make it through, not because of the storm, but because of the light you carry within." It was as if, upon hearing Jesus' words, something in the air shifted. The storm had not ceased, nor had the waves grown gentler, but a sense of clarity began to wash over the disciples like a wave from within. The storm outside remained unchanged, but the storm within them began to quiet. Their fear, which had been a roiling cloud inside their chests, slowly began to dissipate. They still struggled against the wind, still fought to keep the boat steady, but now they did so with purpose, no longer driven by panic, but by a new understanding. And then, as if to affirm their new resolve, the lighthouse appeared again, its beam cutting through the darkness, sharper and clearer than before. It was as though the light had grown brighter, a symbol now not just of hope, but of the unwavering truth that had been hidden in the hearts of the disciples all along. "It is not the light that is dim," Jesus said quietly, almost to himself, but loud enough for them to hear. "It is your hearts that must learn to see it, no matter how far you are from it." Peter turned his gaze toward the lighthouse, his eyes wide with renewed faith. The distance between them and the light felt different now. It was not an obstacle, but a promise. A promise that if they stayed true to the path, the light would always be there. They might have to fight against the storm, but they did not have to fight alone. "I see it now," John said softly, his voice filled with awe. "The light, it was there all along, waiting for us to find it." Peter nodded, a sense of peace flooding him. "We've been searching for it in all the wrong places, haven't we? We've been looking at the storm, at the waves, at the fear, and we forgot to look within." Jesus' eyes twinkled slightly, as if he had known all along that they would understand. "The light is always there, within you. You need only trust it." The boat lurched as another powerful wave struck, but this time the disciples did not flinch. They had found something deeper than fear, something they could hold on to when the storm raged on. It was an inner strength, a new wisdom that had been given to them not by the storm's passing, but by the journey through it. As they continued to row toward the lighthouse, they realized something profound. The light did not wait for them to be free from the storm. It shone regardless. They did not have to wait for the storm to pass in order to find peace. It was within them all along. It was a truth they had carried with them, buried beneath layers of doubt, but now it shone brightly in their hearts. The storm was no longer something they needed to conquer. It was simply a moment in time, fleeting and temporary, that would soon pass. "Rabbi," James said, his voice soft but filled with certainty, "we've been seeking the wrong thing. We thought the light was a place to reach, a destination to arrive at, but it was within us the whole time." Jesus smiled, his gaze gentle. "Yes, James. The light was never about the place or even the storm. It was always about your hearts." As the night drew to a close, the storm began to subside. The wind softened, and the waves, which had once seemed like towering giants, now gently lapped against the side of the boat. The clouds parted slowly, and a soft glow of light began to filter through the horizon. Dawn was breaking, and with it came a sense of renewal. The disciples sat in silence for a while, looking out at the lighthouse, which now stood not as a far-off beacon, but as something real, tangible, something they could almost reach. The world was still dark, but the first light of morning was creeping over the horizon, promising a new day, a new beginning. "Do you see it?" Peter whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "The light, it's not just a symbol anymore. It's real. We found it." Jesus' smile was full of quiet satisfaction. "It was always real, Peter. It was always with you. You simply had to see it." As the boat finally approached the shore, the last remnants of the storm disappeared. The lighthouse now stood proudly behind them, a symbol of everything they had learned. The disciples stepped out onto the soft sand, feeling the coolness of the dawn air against their skin. Their bodies were weary, but their hearts were lighter than they had ever been. They had weathered the storm not by fighting against it, but by allowing it to reveal the truth within them. As they stood on the shore looking at the light of the lighthouse once more, they knew they had been forever changed. The storm had not broken them, it had made them whole. They had learned to trust the light, not because it had been absent, but because they had learned to see it, even in the darkest of times. Jesus turned to his disciples, his expression serene, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Remember this," he said softly, his voice full of love. "The lighthouse does not move no matter how far you wander. The light is always there. You are the ones who must choose to see it. And when you do, it will guide you home no matter how fierce the storm may be." The disciples stood there in awe, their hearts brimming with a newfound understanding. They knew now that no matter what storms they would face in the future, whether on the sea or within their own hearts, the light would always be there. And with that knowledge they knew they could face anything. And so, they set off not in fear but in faith, for they had found the light that would guide them home. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.